Society Matters.
Oh, welcome back to History Repeats. I'm joined once again by Richard Acritelli.
Good seeing you, Liam.
Hey, I'm your host, Liam Carballal, and today I was hoping we could talk a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt, the United States, the Boxer Rebellion, and all the way through the Russo-Japanese War, and just the rise of Japanese imperialism in the early 19th century. So, Rich, how does Theodore Roosevelt, this New York aristocrat, rise from basically nothing to becoming the president of the United States so quickly? I think he was the youngest president ever, right?
At that time,
Yeah.
which I think it was Grant that might have been younger than the youngest, and then Roosevelt about 30 years later, right?
Yeah.
So Grant gets in 1868, 1869, he takes over, and then Roosevelt gets in 1901. So it's about, 32 years later.
Yeah.
So Roosevelt's the youngest to ascend because McKinley gets assassinated by the anarchists up in Buffalo, gets shot right in the chest for like really no apparent reason. And then like McKinley, he was a big business guy, but I guess he was starting to shift maybe towards some reforms itself. And then Roosevelt's the progressive.
Yep.
So how does he kind of come into this position, into this leadership, into this strength?
Yep.
I think locally here, when you go right into the Sagamore Hill, which was the summer White House, right?
Yeah.
Which he loved because no matter how hot it is here on Long Island, he was surrounded by water. So he always had those warm breezes with Cold Spring Harbor, the Sound, and then Oyster Bay, Center Isle right in front of him. He, I would say he came from a family. When you go into Sagamore Hill, I'm trying to remember it, when you walk in to the right-hand side, there's a big picture of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And his father had known Lincoln.
Yeah. He was a reformer.
And Lincoln is what you called, and this is probably what Roosevelt was, unlike his cousin Franklin, that Roosevelt is probably what you consider like a liberal Republican.
A progressive.
Well, he's a progressive, he's a reformer, but he's a liberal Republican. He doesn't want to completely get away from big business. He sees the importance of productivity, money, resources, competing with the British, showing American strength, having guys like Carnegie.
But he also wants to help the common man, not just...
He wants those companies to make more money the following year, but not at the expense of the public.
Yes.
So there's like a common ground that he's going to establish. With the coal mine strike, he says to J.P. Morgan and these big companies, you don't have to give the workers everything they want, but you have to give them something.
Yes.
Right? And you have to work with them a little bit because he was concerned that people might revolt. You had too many people working long hours, making little money, getting hurt at their jobs, and so on.
I think he's quoted as saying something like, if you want to keep socialism out of America, you need to have capitalism work for more people. Yeah,
there's a little bit more of a sense of fairness, right? Yeah. So when you look at Roosevelt, he's a young guy, he's a city kid. He ends up going to Harvard. He grows up with asthma. He boxes, he wrestles, he's an assemblyman. He likes writing. He's going to be writing about naval books and stuff like that. His first wife dies and he goes out west and he becomes like a cowboy and a rancher. And you could see it. I grew up riding horses. My grandfather pulled artillery pieces during the Great Depression. I grew up riding in the shows, in the horse shows. I was like a little buckaroo growing up, I'd be wearing all my Western stuff with my Yankee hat, My
great-grandfather did that too, by the way. He also pulled artillery during
my grandfather did it during the Great Depression. in Brooklyn, and then went into the war later on. If you look at Roosevelt and you see the way he sits a horse on a horse itself there,
Yep.
he's got like some position in there. You could see he's the one in authority. His head is upright and straight and everything. And there's that statue in Oyster Bay, I believe, that he's on the horse, and it's most likely from the Spanish-American War, or even out in Montauk at Camp Hero. So, Roosevelt's larger than life, right? He's somebody who's like the benchmark of presidents actually doing things before they became president. You know who was another president who is similar to him in terms of doing a lot of different jobs?
I don't know.
Was George W. Bush.
Oh, yeah.
No, not George W. George H.W., excuse me. I forgot the H. H.W. Bush, the father. Yeah. He was a pilot during World War II, one of the youngest aviators. He was flying off of aircraft carriers. He was a congressman. He ran the CIA, I believe.
Yes,
he was our representation to the UN.
Yeah.
He ran the Republican Party for a little while. He was a 2-term vice president. He was a businessman.
I didn't know the thing about the UN.
Very, very good baseball player at Yale. So like a Bush, you don't know if they're from up here, like Kenny Bunkport, or down in Texas.
Yep.
But like you get some of these leaders who actually do, they're doers. And that's what Teddy Roosevelt is, right?
Yeah.
So when Teddy becomes president, he was already the head of civil service reform.
Yeah.
He was the police chief of New York City.
Yeah.
He's the assistant secretary of the Navy. He's a colonel, in the Rough Riders, right, which gets activated. He gets the Medal of Honor 100 years later. His son, Teddy, gets it at Normandy, right? So...
only president to win Nobel Peace Prize and the Congressional Medal of Honor.
It's unbelievable. And these are all during young years. Yeah. When he dies, he's not an old man.
I think he's like 60.
Yeah, he's not. That Amazon trip kills him.
Yeah.
So...
he's got a river in the Amazon named after him.
That they almost, what do they call that? The river of no return or something like that. His health deteriorated. That was it. They almost never saw Sagamore Hill again, And it's like, it's based on energy with him, right? So when he becomes president, he already has this backbone of government service.
Yeah.
Right? It's not, too many of the leaders today are very one-dimensional, right? He's been in the government. He understands the government. He wants to do things. You open up with him being a progressive, and he is. And he used to walk around the city streets with Jacob Riis, and he'd catch police officers shacking up with prostitutes, laying on the ground, stealing time, drinking in a bar, and he'd say, come to this address tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it was to see him, the chief of police, so he'd give you a chance to reform.
Yeah.
And then after that was it. Yeah. So, Roosevelt is interested with foreign policy. Every president is an economic, domestic, social president.
Yeah.
And then you have the other side of the coin, they're a foreign policy president as well. Okay? You don't know what the split is. George W. Bush thought he was going to be domestic president, right?
Yeah.
He gets inaugurated in January. 8 months later, you have 9/11, right? So I would say that Roosevelt might have been pretty close to 50-50. Yeah. In terms of everything that he does in the Caribbean, Panama, the Russo-Japanese War, and then, Upton Sinclair in the jungle, and the FDA, and the Meat Inspection Act, and conservation, and
created the FBI.
Child labor laws, and all that stuff, and internal law, and so on. And Roosevelt was one of those guys where one day you didn't like him, one day I didn't like him, one day everyone didn't like him, but he did what was good for the country.
Yeah.
Was some of the political? Yeah, they're all doing things that are political, but it was what was good for the country. And, Russo-Japanese War is interesting because the Russians, it's the Russian bear.
Yeah.
Right? So you got the Russian Bears, this huge country, and it's going all the way towards Germany, and then all the way towards Japan and Korea and Vietnam, and even towards Alaska, right? It's a monster of a country. I mean, most of their population is going to be west of the Ural Mountains, but they got people in Siberia. They got cities and towns there, right?
Yep.
They're just a giant of a country. But their education was always low.
Yeah.
The government was corrupt under the Tsar.
Yeah.
He was more or less an idiot, His Russian army wasn't really prepared. To fight the Japanese, who just, from the moment we opened up Japan in the early 1850s, they started to modernize. And then you get the Japanese gentleman agreement. Okay,
Yes.
The Chinese Exclusion Act and gentleman's agreement are very different from each other.
Yep.
The Chinese said, "Listen, good luck over there, but we don't want to see you again." All right, it's one less mouth to feed.
Yep.
We'll give you a ride to the harbor. We'll get you on the ferry or the boat or whatever. The Japanese kind of said, "All right, we want to see you again. Go to schools like Stony Brook and Columbia and Rutgers and all these big schools, right? And learn English and learn, mathematics and engineering and architecture and science and all this stuff that is taught the Western way."
The Meiji
And then
Restoration,
then bring it over here. We want to learn that. We're not going to back down from their theory. It's not like, in the late 30s and into the 40s, Asia for Asians, right? They weren't really quite there yet,
Yeah.
So the quickest way that they wanted to modernize was learning from us, the British,
Yes.
and so on, right? And the biggest thing that they kind of saw was, all right, we're going to learn from these guys. But it's like us against the Spanish, right? With the Spanish-American War. We can't take on Germany or England because we're not strong enough yet, right?
Yep.
Maybe in 1865, we would have kicked both of their butts, right? With Grant's army. But it deteriorates. That's it, right? There's no need for it. So when you're looking at Japan, they realize that Russia is like a paper tiger itself there. That this is their far eastern post. They're keeping an eye on each other and so on. And the thing is that the Russian prisoners of war were treated better by the Japanese at that time than by their own side.
That's true.
Disorganized, not enough food, weapons that are old, officers that are picked there because they're related to the Tsar, and they might have all this education, but they haven't really done anything. Chesty Puller, who was huge during World War II in the Pacific, a lot of his education is going to come from fighting in the Caribbean.
Really?
You get guys, they get these experiences, and later on,
I think he also fought in the Boxer Rebellion. He was one of the...
He might have been.
Yeah.
He was around for a long time. I'm not quite sure because you got the wars 40. I don't think so. He might have been.
I'm pretty
maybe
sure
a
I read
family
that he
member.
was one of the Marine guys who went in the first... I don't think he was a leader yet, but I think he was...
He might have went in at another point where you had instability there because you had American boats always kind of in and around those rivers and stuff like that,
Right.
So he might have gotten, because Marines have been in there before, because he would have been 60 years old at least at the start of World War II. And he was like one of those younger guys, I think, that Marshall said, war is a young man's game.
Yeah.
And then he ends up fighting in Korea later on. And I think his son might have gotten killed in Vietnam. I could be wrong, though, on that. But you look at the
Google it later.
you look at the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese just go right through them.
Yeah.
And they show we could fight against the Europeans like us fighting against the Spanish, right? That the Japanese, they fight against the Chinese, they fight in that little area of the world, right? The Boxer Rebellion, where they're going to kind of come in.
They take Korea.
Yeah, and they were no better than the Europeans in terms of, taking slices of Chinese territory.
Yeah.
But this is like kind of, they're welcoming to the party.
Yeah.
Hey, we could sit at the same table as you. We could play cards with you. We're maybe not there quite yet, but our Navy's getting there. Our industry's getting there. And they start realizing if we're going to play with the big boys, we need to be in these areas that take their materials and resources and stuff like that, During the Great Depression, we scrapped a lot of the elevated trains and built new ones through New Deal programs.
Yeah.
They bought up our scrap metal and melted it into Japanese ships and trucks and bullets and rifles and stuff like that. So they actually used some of those materials that we end up banning on that embargo in the summer of 41, which was really the prelude to war. Once we did that and the fuel, and then they realized, hey, now we got to go after them. You know, so, but Roosevelt's going to make peace here on Long Island.
Oh yeah, and right in the harbor on his yacht.
Yeah. Well, I think the piece was him looking at butterflies with his kids and cutting and splitting firewood and going swimming, because he had the big Russian who looked like a Russian bear.
Yep.
And then you had the Japanese diplomat as a smaller guy. And then you got Roosevelt, who's like, he's a good sized guy, but he's in the middle. And he's got
boxer. He's not a weakling.
No, he's not a weakling. He could ride a horse, Medal of Honor recipient, tough, right? And, what I was saying before about the nature hikes is that he would go in, right? And it was really like kind of brilliant. They're not far from New York City. They're here on Long Island, but they're far enough where those guys can't really go anywhere at that point, right? He puts them in a room. He goes, all right, I need you to work on this here. I'll be back in an hour.
Yeah.
So he's cutting and splitting firewood, comes back, gets a little lemonade. Where you guys at? All right, you need to work more on this here. Then he takes the kids for a hike, right?
Yep.
Then he comes back, right? Gets another glass of lemonade.
Yep.
Where are you at? All right, this looks good. Now we got to start this because you're going to finish this tomorrow. All right? Now, why does Roosevelt not want the Japanese to completely go through the Russians? Because it's a counterbalance. Because now they're like, wow, the Japanese surprise everyone here.
Yep.
And we want them to still have the Russians to worry about to a certain degree. But I think that Russo-Japanese War, when did the Soviets come in? 1917, right? You get Lenin comes in from Switzerland, and
the Japanese invade.
The treaty at Brest-Litovsk and all that stuff, right? So they're a good 12 years away from slowly but surely the Tsar like losing, his touch on reality, his government, and so on. And then the Japanese. So the Russians are coming down, the Japanese are kind of coming up. That sort of thing. So
there's revolution in 1905, and then as the Bolshevik in 1917.
What was that, Valentine's Day, or am I getting that wrong? Where the Tsar's troops fired on the people, right? It was a bloody massacre or something like that. Right?
Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday there, right?
I think the revolution was, I think you might actually be right. The revolution was in February, so it might have been.
Somewhere along those lines there, where instead of the Russian government saying, all right, let's sit down, all right, we're not going to give you everything at once, but we're going to do these reforms, right? Instead, they crush it, and then the communists, you like the Boxer Rebellion. Well, guess what? Communism isn't going to start today or tomorrow after the Boxer Rebellion, but it leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. This is why we have to go against the Europeans, the Americans, the Russians, the Japanese, because you're totally exploiting us. You're taken, right? The open door was John Hay, who was one of the secretaries for Lincoln. You had Nicolay and Hay. They write these massive accounts, of the Civil War. You know who writes the best books? Are the advisors. It's like the advisors to Trump. It's those people that are the secondary and third, because they see everything. They're the ones who have to carry everything out. And then, they're more trustworthy. I sat in these meetings. I was told to do this. I was told to do that. Well, that was Nicolay and Hay, right? You kind of trust them a little bit more than some 4-star general or some, politician where they have their own agendas, right?
They want to save their own.
So it's their own perception, right? So what ends up happening is that John Hay is going to come out and say, with the open door policy, and is that famous picture of the Chinese man in the back behind all the Europeans with the knives and everything, right?
Cutting up the cake as his China.
They're cutting everything up, and they're doing this, right? So what ends up happening is he goes, all right, you want all this stuff, you could still have it, but you have to treat the Chinese with more respect. Pay for the goods, don't take it. Pay for taxes, infrastructure.
Yeah.
The profit is so immense.
Yeah.
It's still going to be there. If you don't do these things, right, they're going to sooner or later revolt.
Yeah.
What do? They revolt. And what do the Europeans say to, hey, you have no business telling us this here? It's kind of like the Europeans with the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's one of those things where they're going to make them pay for it.
Yeah.
We make a separate peace with Germany in 1922.
Yeah.
Even though Wilson wanted the Treaty of Versailles, right? And he wrecks his health fighting for it. Americans finally say, listen, this is their problem. We tried to help out. We prevented them from getting overrun by the Germans, but they're going down the same road. Hay is telling these guys, you have to treat them with respect. And then what do? They go after every Caucasian they can get their hands on. And now the militaries have to send their navies into the internal parts of China, which is not around the corner. You know, that's a far trip today, let alone 120 years ago or 130 years ago. You know, it's nuts. You know, and then you look at the communism. You know, is going to start coming out slowly but surely. Hey, listen, you have no food, you have no jobs, you have no prospects. Yeah, right. We're better off being all equally miserable, okay, with maybe the government having a little bit more than us, just a little bit more, right, than having 10 or 15% of the population living high in a hog and we're serving them, you know, that sort of thing. So it's, you know, it's a big thing. And it's like, you know, your podcast is history repeats itself. Yeah. This can and will happen, you know, down the road, you know, and it's a big concern, you know, and that's why I think with World War II, the Soviets wanted reparations. They wanted to ship off half of eastern part of Germany because their country was completely, you know, wrecked, you know. So it's one of those things that's out there, you know, where you do have to watch how you treat countries. Yeah. You know? So.
Yeah, I think that was one of Roosevelt's strengths. Is he understood we can't just be imperialist and dicks.
Well, he saw the big picture. You know, we were imperialists here in the Caribbean because we didn't want the Europeans here. Yeah, at a time where these navies were only getting stronger, and you know, once they come in, they don't leave, right? So. But he saw the big picture, like with the Russo-Japanese War, where maybe keeping the Russians alive and keeping some armaments there is a strong counterbalance against the Japanese, who are moving in one direction, is forward. In less than 100 years from when they
just taken the Philippines.
In less than 100 years from they open up, they almost beat us at Pearl Harbor. If those aircraft carriers are Pearl Harbor, it's a totally different situation.
Attack the submarines.
Everything. I mean, they gave us a licking without our main ships there, and it was still bad, you know. So
this has been History Repeats. I'm your host, Liam Carballal, and thank you to hmTV for giving us this opportunity to talk today. Good night, and stay tuned till next time.